From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. And I am out and about looking at a smallish piece of land that could soon be China. I'm not in China. I know that I'm in London because I'm absolutely wet through with thick drizzle. I can see just behind me the Tower of London. I passed Tower Bridge earlier. There's a smattering of vape shops, all the London sites. And this is the old Royal Mint building, a big old Palladian-looking thing with some colonnades, a little court and a fence peering into it. But this is what the Chinese government want to be their new embassy in the UK, a mega embassy. There have been concerns and objections from Conservative MPs, Labour backbenchers, the US government even, who fear that this will be a spying base for the Chinese government. But this week, the Prime Minister is expected to give the project the green light. Should we be worried? Is this an expanding bricks and mortar security threat right in the heart of London? Can a story be both dramatic and about planning permission? We will find out. The story today is China's mega embassy just a mega spy base?
My name is Cindy Yu. I'm a columnist for The Times and Sunday Times, and I often write about China.
My name is Geraldine Scott. I'm the assistant political editor at The Times, which means I cover everything from Westminster gossip to big geopolitical events like the thing we're discussing today.
Yes, which at its heart is a planning decision. But explain first of all what is being proposed. This has been described as a mega embassy. How mega are we talking?
So this is mega in terms of both its size, the scale, and its importance. This is in the former Royal Mint building, which people may know. It's near the Tower of London, so slap bang in a very iconic spot in London. But when it's done, it's going to be, it's around 700,000 square feet. It would be the largest embassy in Europe. People might be aware of the newish at this stage, I guess, US embassy in London, which is giant and is nicknamed the Fortress. It's going to be bigger than that, and it'll have things like a cultural centre, accommodation for more than 200 staff, and things like that. So it's going to be a big old premises.
Cindy, why does China want or need it?
Well, at the moment, the Chinese diplomatic presence is headquartered in Portland Place in central London, which is basically two terraced townhouses next to each other. And they've had that site for over 100 years now. They are now spilling out of that site. I think there's about 7 different sites they have diplomatic presence in London at the moment. So, for example, the defence attaché is in Hampstead, the visa service is in the city. It's all over the place. And the one Chinese diplomat I spoke to said that basically when they have an all-staff meeting, people have to go from across London into Portland Place, and they don't even have a room that's big enough to hold all of them in. So it is a big diplomatic presence, about 140 diplomats. And so they want somewhere that they could have that kind of a modern office building, or so they say at least. And then also, bear in mind that actually this is China, a deeply distrustful country. And so they want somewhere where they can put their diplomats in the same accommodation and office, so that they're not, going around London, God knows what they're getting up to, fraternising with Brits, God forbid. And so that's one of the things that, is very important to them, is just to have everyone under the same thumb, as it were. And then a very good rumour I heard, because Jerry mentioned the US Embassy, is that when the US Embassy opened in 2018, they were like, well, we also need a big one. But this Chinese diplomat denied that account very vehemently. But I think maybe there's a grain of truth in that.
And actually, it was 2018 that they actually bought the site, wasn't it? And they've just been sitting on it or trying to get it developed for a while, this enormous site.
Yeah, that's right. And isn't this fascinating? Because think about what a different time it was for British-China relations in 2018, right? So this is kind of deep in the kind of golden era, we call it. There was kind of not really that much scrutiny of like Chinese state activity, which is all now completely changed. That era is not where we are as a country anymore, but clearly we're still living with consequences, because this embassy row is still going on. China bought the site for a lot of money, 255 million. And, since then, it's been kind of controversy after controversy.
So before we get to the kind of white heat of the controversy at the moment, Cindy, just take us through how things have bubbled up since 2018. I take Jerry's point that it was a different time in terms of Chinese-UK relations, but slowly the concern about this has been ramping up, has it not?
Yeah, and arguably the initial origins of this plan have always smelled a bit. And the Sunday Times has done some really good reporting on this. So just briefly on that 2018 period again, Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary. He was being advised by Eddie Lister, who he had taken from City Hall with him. And the Sunday Times, a couple of years later, then found out that actually Eddie Lister was being paid by the Foreign Office as an advisor. The company that was being hired by China to find a new site for its embassy, as well as the property company that owned the Royal Mint that then sold the site to China. And so he denies any wrongdoing. He denies a conflict of interest, and he says that his, 3 jobs there were not, overlapping with each other. But it's clearly not ideal, I think, in terms of a strategic asset like this, and one that has had so many problems. So I think, it's cursed from the beginning is how I would probably say it. But since then, initially the planning permission was with local authorities. Tower Hamlets Council rejected it in 2022, citing safety, security and community impact. The Labour government then calls in the application in October 2024. And I think here there's a bit of interesting dynamic going on where China probably thought that the Labour government would let it through a bit more easily than the Conservatives would, because after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, the Conservatives obviously went through that really kind of overcorrection of the golden era moment. So I think they didn't try that much then. And since then, it's been under the central government's decision. The deadline after deadline has been pushed back. We understand that the Met Police and the security services last year have dropped their opposition to the plans. And so that's why imminently now we are expecting central government to approve it. But before that, they delayed it once again from end of last year to this month. So yeah, I mean, let's see whether or not it really gets approved this time around.
Okay, so Jerry, assuming we have run out of long grass, how have parliamentarians reacted to this growing reporting and suspicion that actually the Prime Minister is going to say, yeah, go ahead, you can develop this into your mega embassy?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, because there has been pushback consistently definitely from like Tory politicians actually, but more and more you have seen this pushback from Labour politicians as well. I think you've seen kind of Labour MPs get a bit more hawkish on China in the last few years for sure. So then we also had this urgent question last week, which was on Tuesday. You had backbenchers, Tories, who were really kind of going for Matthew Pennycook, who's the poor planning minister, because technically this is a planning decision, right? Who have been put up in the Commons to answer these questions rather than a Foreign Office minister, who were, basically giving him a really hard time.
Every security briefing I had identifies China as a hostile state to the UK. I am in no doubt that this mega embassy should not be allowed to go ahead.
Not one contribution in this House can say that this isn't a threat to national security and that this is in any way a good and solid planning application. So how can this government be so naive to accept it?
The minister said he could not distill our relationship into China down to one word. Oh, yes, we can. It's a very big word, Mr. Speaker. It's no.
Yeah.
And he was giving the stereotypical non-answers of, this is a judicial process, we won't be commenting until it's done, blah, 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 blah.
As I have stressed before, and I'm afraid I will have to do so repeatedly, no decision has been made. I cannot comment on any aspects of the case. It's a live case for planning ministers to determine. All material considerations will be taken into account when making a decision, but I'm afraid I can't comment on any specific national security concerns.
And how strong would you say the upset is on the Labour benches? Obviously, they've got good track record with forcing the government to do what it might not want to do or wasn't planning to do. I mean, on this, how strong a voice is the Labour contingent?
Well, look, I think they're a strong voice, but I think actually what is interesting, and I'm sure we'll get into this, is the US. The US has come out very strongly against this plan in the last few days. They're still concerned about it. And if you think that Keir Starmer is heavily swayed by his backbenchers at the moment, he's even more heavily swayed by Donald Trump and the US administration. He doesn't want to do anything to damage that relationship that he has so carefully crafted. So look, I think let's see how that plays out in the next few days.
Let's actually get into some of the meat of the controversies. Cindy, what actually are the concerns, the tangible concerns, other than, there might be more accommodation for more Chinese diplomats who are maybe also spies?
I think there's been a myriad of concerns. First and foremost is the security concerns when it comes to literally espionage. So I don't know if the government did any kind of security assessment at the time of the sale, but we haven't heard much about that if they did. But anyway, in the subsequent years, it has transpired that there is probably sensitive cables linking the City of London, transmitting financial data across London, very near or even underneath the site that is being proposed. And there was a Times and the Sunday Times that first found, actually, that in the planning permissions, there were these plans to build basement rooms very close or even over the top of these cables. And so the question gets raised, what are they for?
And the worry is that from the basement of the Chinese embassy, they might be able to cut those cables and cause disruption in the city, I think
the worry, yes, I mean, probably theoretically they could cut it, but I think the more realistic worry is that they could tap them. And when you speak to security experts, the idea is that you might get all of this data, and then even if you can't decode it at the moment, in future with the help of AI or quantum computing, you can then kind of make sense of the transactions that are happening in the City of London. So that's one worry. Then there is a transnational repression worry about dissidents. Of course, the UK has become home to over 100,000 Hong Kongers since the national security law. There are other dissidents, Tibetans, Uyghurs, as well as people who are just politically opposed to the Chinese government, right? Who worry that this big diplomatic presence will be a way for China to expand its repression of those people here in the UK and in London specifically.
And maybe even imprison people in it?
That's certainly been one of the accusations. I've got my own thoughts on why that's not so likely. And then the other worry I think that I've heard is also just kind of this idea of this historic site, the symbol of London, being used as a symbol of China instead. And I think emotively that is very, very difficult as well. So that symbolism on both ends there, I think, would be maybe my third bucket of concerns. But I don't know if, Jerry, you feel like even more concerns than that as well.
I think the only one that I would add is the previous objection from the Met Police, which has now seemingly been dropped, was about policing and whether this particular site was appropriate in order to contain any protests that might occur. There have been protests held outside this site already in kind of preparation for this, and they have attracted thousands of people. And the Met's previous concern was because of the location, busy road, that kind of thing, but actually it would not be an appropriate location for that to happen. Those concerns seem to have gone away. There is various reporting, very good reporting in the Times and Sunday Times, I must say, about why that might have happened and the influence that might have been placed on that. But, there are kind of practical concerns as well of just like, can we actually contain this thing? So that's another area to look at as well.
Yeah. Cindy, how likely or worrisome do you think any of those buckets are that you outlined there? Maybe starting with the spying threat. I mean, is that really going to be shifted by there being this enormous facility in which they could base themselves?
Yeah, so I think for me, of all of these threats, security is the main concern. It's important to be contextual here in the sense that embassies have been used as hubs of espionage for, ever. And actually, so I spoke to Nigel Inkster, who was a former director at MI6, and he says that actually because it's so obvious to spy from embassies, they have now become hubs of surveillance by counter-surveillance as well. And so actually increasingly the espionage is being dispersed outside of embassies. In terms of the cables themselves, this is why I think the MI5 and MI6 green lighting is so important. If they had not come out and said, we can mitigate this risk, then I don't think we should be letting this embassy go ahead at all. But they say that they can mitigate the risk. And so whatever they think they can do about the cables, or maybe weighed up against the idea of having all these diplomats in one place where MI5 will find them easier to surveil as well, instead of, the 7 locations that I previously mentioned, they clearly think that security concern is manageable.
Even though there is the physical proximity to some of those sensitive data cables, not sensitive in that they're carrying any kind of national secrets, but, it is information from the City of London about important financial transactions.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I haven't seen the security assessment that goes into that what the calculus is there. And I've had, when I make this argument, people often say, but why should we trust the security services when there's so much political baggage surrounding this? And I think that's a really fair counter argument. But I guess my counter to that would be, if not MI5 and MI6, then I'm not sure who we should be trusting.
No.
And then for some of the other concerns, transnational repression, massive problem in this country. I've interviewed many of the Hong Kongers who came here after national security law, and they are scared for their families, for themselves. And I think MI5 need to do much more to say, look, we're here. We're going to protect you. Let us know what you need, and then be much more aware and alive to that issue. But the idea that the Chinese will be using their embassy to imprison and or torture people in the basement is, I think, more the stuff of James Bond than the stuff of reality. Because it will be Met policed on the gates, as all embassies are. It will be heavily surveilled by MI5. It will just be making so much more work for themselves to drag dissidents into that space than, let's say, buy up a property somewhere in, Hull and drag people there, get a safe house somewhere. So that's a real threat, and we need to be concerned about that. But the embassy is a red herring in that debate. And then in terms of the symbolism, yes, of course, Royal Mint, would we rather it was luxury apartments than the embassy for China? Maybe yes, but I do think that's a question for 2018, and we're here now, and the calculus, the ledger for me on the other side of things, of whether or not you want to rupture relations with China over this, I think it's a question for me about picking your battles.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But Jerry, on all of those points there, how is all of those arguments settled with MPs who have been kicking up a storm about this, as you've said? And also, do you get the sense that there is quite a bit of upset behind the scenes? Because we have seen a lot of leaks. I mean, some leaks of the actual plans of the embassy have made it into the papers. There are clearly some people really trying to stop this from happening who are worried.
Look, I think there's a few things to say here. I think, MI5 and MI6 have said they can mitigate that risk. But I think for those who are still worried about this embassy, they would say that's not the same as there being no risk, right? And what some people who are very hawkish on China would argue is that the bar should actually be higher for our risk appetite with a country that we, the Britain won't call a threat for various political reasons, but obviously the government thinks it is. So I think there's that. And there is a real world precedent to this as well. The US government ordered the Chinese consulate in Houston to be shut down. They accused it of being a hub for espionage and IP theft. There was footage of documents being burned in the courtyard as the closure loomed. So this is not, this isn't paranoia. It does happen. And I think the dissident point is a really key one, and one that really does get lost in this debate quite often. If there is this mega embassy, what does that say to dissidents who have kind of come to this country and want to be safe? So I think really trust is the thing that MPs and those who are campaigning is the critical issue here, right? It's do you trust our government to be doing this in the interest of national security, or is it in the interests of the economy? And we can get on to talking about, why Keir Starmer has maybe softened his approach on China, but also how much do we want to trust the Chinese government in building this embassy? So it is a test of trust, and those who are on the more hawkish side, the MPs and the campaigners, will say, well, we shouldn't be trusting Beijing at all, frankly.
Jerry, Cindy, we're talking about this Chinese mega embassy, which is looking like it could be approved at the site of the Old Royal Mint right in the centre of the City of London. Cindy, you mentioned a moment ago what actually this means to the broader relationship between the UK government and the Chinese government. If Keir Starmer were to say, actually, you know what, this is a bit too risky, no thanks, would that really be a massive slap in the face of the Chinese government, for which there would be massive rebuttals, which the UK would be very stressed about? Or would they not really care?
So, yes, it would be a massive slap in the face of the Chinese government. We don't know what the repercussions will be. And so I do think there's a fair argument to say, well, let's just slap them in the face and see what happens. How much can they really do? And I think that's a fair argument, and just depends on how risk averse and how important you think it is to keep that relationship stable. But the reason I think it would be nevertheless a massive slap in the face is that because it's dragged on for such a long time, and actually the Chinese diplomats in London are getting ever more impatient. And so I think if in 2019 someone in government has said, just cut cut our losses, we're going to give them a different site, let's not do this. If Tories at that point had said that, then I actually think the problem wouldn't be as big as it is right now. But because we've let it fester and the Chinese have got so impatient, and in the meantime kind of funneling money into this project on lawyers and on planning permission, all this sort of stuff, the row has become harder to contain because of how long it's dragged on. And I actually think the Conservative government has a lot to answer for. Obviously there was a lot of domestic politics happening at the time, but if the plug had been pulled earlier, we would just be in a much better position now.
There was a lot of domestic politics happening. But on that
euphemistically, a lot of domestic politics.
But on your point about actually it being about how it's dragged on, do you think there is a world in which, had they just quite early out the gate said, absolutely not, don't be ridiculous, do you think that the Chinese government might in some way respect that? I'm thinking about another former MI6 chief, Richard Moore, who was saying on a slightly different topic that actually China responds to strength, and then actually maybe it's the obfuscation and the very British dragging out which has just annoyed them, as opposed to if had they said, no, don't be ridiculous.
I'm never super confident in the argument of China respects strength or China disrespects weakness, because I feel like that's too anthropomorphizing of a whole country. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think they will just do what is in their national interest. They'll push if they can. They'll retreat if they have to. I think what is the case is that if in 2019 or even in 2018, before the sale had gone through, someone said, look, have this other very nice site, just not so sensitive and not so central, then I don't think the Chinese would be nearly as furious as they would be now if someone said that to them. And so this then goes back to the wider question here of that Jerry mentioned, which is the successive governments not having a consistent and thought through and strategic China policy.
Jerry?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's clearly the case, that there has been kind of ebbs and flows of the way that we have seen China and interacted, not really taken having a proper strategy towards China. But it is clear that this Labour government is softer, and it's as simple as that. We see it with the fact that there have been multiple trips to China over these last few months that they're openly saying that they want Chinese investment in things whilst also protecting critical industries.
The scale of the opportunity in China is immense. Our task is to help British businesses win their share of that opportunity in a way that is safe for our country.
We know Keir Starmer is due to go on a visit probably at the end of this month, and more than that, we have that footage from I think it was the G20 or was it the G7? It was an international summit where Starmer met with China's president, and at the start of that meeting, the top of that meeting, when journalists were still allowed to be in the room, Starmer said to Xi Jinping, he said, you asked us to call in the embassy decision.
You raised the Chinese embassy building in London when we spoke on the telephone. And we have since taken action by calling in that application. Now we have to follow the legal process and timeline.
But this isn't, in a busy political time, actually this isn't the first row that Keir Starmer has had over China. Of course, even just in the past few months, we of course famously had that case where the prosecution collapsed against two men, Chris Cash and Chris Berry, who were accused of spying on members of parliament and handing some of that information to Chinese handlers, something which they both really deny. But Jerry, still lots of questions about how all of that was handled badly, some would say.
Yeah, that's right. And, who is involved in these decisions? There was a, big focus on Jonathan Powell, who is Starmer's foreign affairs advisor, and the kind of involvement that he might have had in that and his kind of approach to China being potentially softer. Look, I think what the government wants to do is be in a position where it can be tough on the security aspects, but also reap the economic benefits. And if you are a critic of that approach, you would say that is not possible, because what you are then saying there is that, things can be separated in the Chinese system, whereas, it's a wholesale system. But look, that's the government's aim, and let's see how it works out.
Cindy, if you were to sack off journalism and the Times and go and be Starmer's national security advisor, your suggestion would be what? On this, but also the broader suite of how we deal with China?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. Jen, just linking that to Jerry's second point about whether or not it's possible to have your cake and eat it. I think it'll be really, really hard. And that is why I laugh when you give me this hypothetical situation. So I do not want this job. But I think
What's a poison chalice?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we have to. We have to try our best to have our cake and eat it, because that is what international relations is. Frankly, we are not going to agree with all the countries in the world. You're not going to be always the most powerful country in the world, which is what this country is now experiencing after the decline of empire and as American power gets challenged by Chinese power. So yeah, we're going to have to coexist with some countries that we don't like the look of, because frankly speaking, what are you going to do? You know, you can force regime change on weaker countries and hope that the future for them brings better things. For stronger countries like China and possibly like Russia, you just have to do your best to fulfill your national interest whilst coexisting with them.
But in the past, though, it wasn't just countries looking out in the West for their national interest, you know, when dealing with China. They were part of a defined bloc broadly on the same page in how they approach China, and now we're not in that world.
Well, were we ever in that world? I think we should be in that world. I think that's the ideal situation to be in. So I actually think that, you know, if I were Jonathan Powell, I would say that the UK needs to ally with like-minded countries much more. So countries in the EU, countries like, for example, Australia, Canada, Japan, because actually, you know, this special relationship is great, but the US is also a slightly unreliable partner, as we have seen from events in the last 2 weeks. So actually, what the UK as a middle-ranking power in the 21st century needs to do is to bolster its own weight. And to do that, one way to do that is through alliances. The other way to not get buffeted by all these torrents is to not pick unnecessary battles, I think is the way I would phrase it. If I were Jonathan Powell, the first thing I would have done is do a proper China audit. What are the ways in which China has influence in the British economy, in maybe militarily, technologically, all sorts of stuff? You know, have that kind of map laid out, a blueprint laid out. Then you prioritize. What are the absolute red core interests for the UK that we will never, ever sacrifice? And I think in the top of that should be national security in terms of critical infrastructure, for example. But in other things, for example, you know, buying Chinese manufactured toys or whatever, you know, I'm like, that's the bottom of the list for me. And then so you prioritize in that way, and you decide, okay, in which area are we going to cut off where? And that is what I, in my kind of imaginary nice world, thought the China audit would be. Very naive of me, because then it got bottled. And now we have 2 paragraphs from the National Security Strategy about how we need to coexist with China, but with nothing specific on it. And so I think Jerry's totally right in a sense of like, it is hard, it's hard and maybe impossible to have your cake and eat it too. But I don't see any other option other than to try our best. And
in the near term, that is going to take the shape of Keir Starmer allowing this mega embassy to go forward and them allowed to develop it. Jerry, how is that going to play out in the coming week? What is actually going to happen?
Yeah, so look, there is always the chance that this decision is delayed again. It has been delayed before, multiple times, as Cindy said earlier, but all signs point towards this being approved on Tuesday. And look, how this is going to play out is that there will be a big backlash. There will be protests. What will be particularly interesting is to see what the US reaction is. I think for me, the political problem here is quite simple in a way. Like I appreciate we've just spent ages talking about how complex this is, and it is, but the political problem is quite simple, right? If there are future stories, scandals, revelations, which there will be, which are to do with China intimidation, another Westminster spying scandal, cyber attacks, hacks, this decision becomes essentially a symbol of naivety. You know, it's that thing that people will then point to and say, oh my gosh, how stupid have we been to allow this? So I think, you know, in the short term, you'll get the kind of fiery reaction maybe from the US, from campaign groups, from people like that. In the longer term, I think what looks pragmatic, and to be clear, that's what the government wants to achieve. They want to be pragmatic in this. But what looks pragmatic now ends up being massively problematic down the line when further things happen. So I think that, you know, it's tricky. I wouldn't want to be in this position of making this decision at all.
Well, we'll see what happens. Cindy, Jerry, maybe I'll see you at the Old Royal Mint for some Ferrero Rocher before we know it. Thank you both.
I'm not sure we'll be invited.
That was Gerry Scott, assistant political editor for The Times, and Cindy Yu, a columnist and contributing editor for The Times and The Sunday Times. That is it from us today. Today's producer was Micaela Arneson. The executive producer was Taryn Siegel. Sound design and theme composition were by Maula Seto. And I'm Luke Jones. See you very soon.